Welcome to those of you who are already online. We're just going to give it another minute or two before we start tonight. Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have other folks join us as we get into things here in the next few minutes. My name is Stephen Payne. I'm the director of the Bronx County Historical Society. Happy New Year to everyone who's joining us tonight. See a lot of familiar names and some that aren't as familiar, but glad to have everyone who is signed in here tonight. We have a very exciting talk ahead of us this evening, and it's actually the second virtual event on Hart Island that we've hosted this year. It's going to be quite a bit different than the last event on Hart Island, and have some really extremely knowledgeable folks on Hart Island as our presenters tonight. So welcome one and all. Hope to see all of you here tonight at our future events. You can check out what's going on with us at bronxhistory.org. January is a little bit of a quiet month for us, but there'll be a couple events later in the month aside from this one. And we have Edgar Allan Poe's birthday celebration coming up as well on January 19th at Poe Cottage. And we have a lot planned in February that still has to make it onto the website, but stay tuned for that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters tonight. First of all, Melinda Hunt. Melinda Hunt is an interdisciplinary artist and founding director of the Hart Island Project. She holds an MFA from the Yale School of Art and an MS in Digital Imaging and Design from NYU. She began working on Hart Island with photographer Joel Sternfeld in 1991, so she's been at it a while, extremely knowledgeable about Hart Island. They published a book together, Hart Island, in 1998. Melinda has also directed a film, Hart Island, an American Cemetery, that was released in 2008. She received awards from the New York State Council on the Arts in Public Art, Film, and Electronic Art. She's also received the Canada Council InterArts Awards multiple years, and the New York State Council on the Arts a fellowship in 2017. She directed development of Traveling Cloud Museum, which is definitely an interesting thing to check out, which was produced in collaboration with Studio Airport and Webmine.nl in the Netherlands. In 2019, she received the New York City Women's Fund Award for directing the web series AIDS Burials on Hart Island. Thank you for being with us, Melinda. Now, our second presenter for tonight is Jake Boswell, an associate professor and undergraduate studies chair of landscape architecture at The Ohio State University. His work centers on the entanglement of cultural, technological, and natural systems in the production of designed and vernacular landscapes, with a specific focus on climatic imaginaries and attempts to alter climate. He comes to this interest through an education and training in landscape architecture, city planning, and cultural anthropology, and he pursues this work through a hybrid practice centered on historical inquiry and design speculation. His writing has been published nationally and internationally, and his speculative and applied design works have received recognition in numerous international design competitions. So thank you again, Melinda and Jake, and welcome everyone to Landscape of Hope, an end to mass burials on Hart Island. So take it away, Melinda and Jake, and I'll be back with for the Q&A section to help moderate that later on.
Great. Thank you. So thank you for inviting us to speak today. I know many of you, I'm sure, through the Hart Island Project and some of the events that we've done in the Bronx. I'll just go over briefly an introduction to the Hart Island Project for those of you who may not know us. Our mission is to assist low-income marginalized people to preserve their histories, gain access to information about the buried, and destigmatize city burials. For those who seek a city burial, seek an affordable green burial, or choose a city burial for any reason. Hart Island is the largest natural burial ground in the United States. Because it was managed by the penal system for over 150 years, it is deeply stigmatized. Our mission is to make Hart Island visible and accessible and encourage New Yorkers to choose a city burial over cremation. The Hart Island Project is an organization in New York. Through a series of creative projects, our work resulted in legislation ending penal control of Hart Island. At the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic in New York City, prison labor ended, and the Human Resource Administration opened an Office of Burial Services, and NYC Parks assumed jurisdiction of the landscape. This year, NYC Parks contracted a master plan. Actually, it's last year, it's a year now, for Hart Island to Star White House. However, ending the Civil War era mass burial practice is not within scope of this contract, and we believe it is time to end mass burials in New York City. So what we're presenting here today is a brief history of the burial practice and proof of concept for how the city could switch to individual burials. We hope you will consider this presentation as an opportunity to end mass burials, which are culturally offensive to most people. So this is an image, an engraving done at the end, published at the end of the American Civil War. Hart Island was leased by the Union Army as a training ground for Union soldiers, including 3 regiments of United States colored troops. Here we see an engraving showing numerous barracks on the northern end of Hart Island. These buildings were used to house 3,413 Confederate prisoners of war. After the war, the city purchased Hart Island in 1868, and these buildings were used to house city prisoners. Soldiers buried on Hart Island were removed to national cemeteries before city burials began in 1869. Common plots were used to bury unidentified soldiers at Gettysburg, and this practice was eventually adopted by the city of New York. Here we have a copy of the death certificate of Louisa Van Slyke, who was the first person to be buried on Hart Island in April 1869. She was buried in an individual grave somewhere on Hart Island. New York City continued to offer individual burials for a fee into the 20th century. Individual burials were eventually phased out because it was difficult to collect fees and keep track of individual graves. Today, GPS technology offers a way to resume individual burials. By May 1872, the Department of Charities and Correction, which was the agency that purchased Hart Island, had adopted a system of burials developed during the Civil War with 150 per plot laid out in a consistent grid. To keep track of the position of each box within a plot, ledger books recorded information about each decedent. This system permits the city to return remains to family if they did not agree to a city burial. New York State sepulcher laws require this of every municipality in the state. With over 50,000 deaths per year in New York City, this requires the agency in charge of burials to deploy a highly organized system that tracks each body from the place of death to the grave. On Hart Island, New Yorkers are buried in bureaucracy, but they are also contributing positively to the environment by not being cremated or embalmed and buried in a vault. Jacob Riis's first photograph was taken on Hart Island around 1890, and it shows boxes laid out in stacked rows. A draft manuscript by Dr. George Smith describes the burial practice on Hart Island during his time working there as a psychiatrist from 1882 through 1895. Although it is a little hard to read, Dr. Smith describes a burial practice that is essentially the same today. A trench was a quadrangle about 12 feet deep, about 30 feet long, 15 to 16 feet wide. Pure plain pine coffins were used. These coffins are marked not only by a card by the clerk in the branch workhouse, but the number and name of the body and the number of the coffin and the number of the trench is kept in a book. Now, coffin number 1 is put at the bottom of the trench at the upper left-hand corner, feet towards the center. Number 2 and so on up to 25. Each coffin is put in, earth is put over it, and when there are 25 coffins in a row, coffin number 26 is placed opposite coffin number 1 with feet toward the center, and so on up to 50. 50 is opposite 25. The trench continues to be filled in this manner with double rows of coffins until it is filled. And until 1931, each plot consisted of 3 layers of 50 boxes or 150 per trench. Numbered plot markers were placed at the head of each plot. If these markers move, the grid is lost, along with the identities of all the graves within the plot. If the ledgers are lost or destroyed in a fire, as happened in 1977, there is no way to know the identities of bodies within a plot. If the information is not recorded correctly, the city is liable for mishandling human remains if a family asserts its sepulcher rights in court. In 2008, I filed a criminal complaint when we noticed a plot of 1,000 infants was listed in 2 different plot numbers, both of which were already assigned to earlier burials. Although the city is required to keep track of every individual buried on public land, there is no obligation to preserve intact burial plots forever. Once a body is fully decomposed, it is legal in New York State to reuse graves. This is different from private cemeteries, which sell deeds to burial plots that cannot be reused except by the owners. In 1930, land for burials on Hart Island was full. With the opening of Rikers Island Jail in 1927, there was discussion of closing the workhouse and the cemetery on Hart Island and transferring jurisdiction to parks. Instead, the workhouse remained open until 1966, and the city began to reuse older graves. In 1931, the ledger indicates that plot A1, this is from 1872, has become plot 525. In 2002, I interviewed a retired correction officer who explained how this was done. The plot was opened and bones moved to one end. Skeletal remains were mixed, but stayed within the plot, and new boxes were added in 3 sections. Instead of 3 layers of 50, boxes were organized vertically in 3 sections. In 2022, the Human Resources Administration, HRA, which took over managing the burials from the DOC in 2021, completed a burial capacity study. After working with attorneys for a year, we managed to get a copy of the study in 2023. The study claims that state laws would have to change for the city to reuse older graves. All of the northern half of our Hart Island now has graves that are older than 30 years. The study does not acknowledge that burial plots were reused many times over between 1931 and 1977. Here is a diagram from the study which proposes to decrease the space between plots, and this has been implemented to preserve burial space. In June 2024, burial plots became 33% more dense with the addition of a fourth layer. As of this year, each section contains 64 or 72 boxes for a total of 200 boxes per plot. This image gives you a sense of the scale of these graves. They're enormous. Even with increasing the density of each plot and placing them closer together, we think the city will soon run out of burial space on Hart Island. 1 year ago, the landscape firm Star Whitehouse began working on a master plan for Hart Island. They held a public information session last June and presented this slide showing future burial space on Hart Island, which is limited to the areas in yellow where buildings were recently removed. Since then, we got a copy of the master plan contract. The end product of this $500,000 plan does not include a review of the burial practice or a strategy for managing the landscape. We believe that Park's master plan should include an examination of the burial practice, and currently this is out of scope. We seek to address this problem with a proof of concept, which we've titled Landscape of Hope, a plan to end mass burials on Hart Island. And here you can see they list what the end product is, which is to report on existing conditions, improve the visitor experience, improving the natural ecology, improving resiliency of the island to severe weather events, improving operational functions on the island. But there's no real look at this burial practice, what underlies the landscape. And the burials are the primary function of this real estate for New York City. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jake.
Great. Thanks, Melinda. And thanks to Stephen for inviting us to talk tonight. As Melinda said, I'm Jake Boswell, and I'm a professor of landscape architecture at Ohio State. And I'm working with two colleagues on this project. We've been working on it for about 2 years now, and I want to acknowledge them. They're Brendan Eyre and Jack Gruber. As Melinda said, for this strategy, we asked ourselves whether it would be possible to end the practice of mass burials on Hart Island while keeping the island an active burial ground. And we looked at what that would mean for management of the island, both in terms of burial, but also visitation, memorialization, and climate change preparedness. So what I'm going to be showing you is a proof of concept for one way that the city might be able to do that. When we started to do this, we set out a couple of goals for ourselves based on what we heard when talking to family members and friends of people who were buried on the island and what their experiences have been when attempting to visit the island and what they wanted for the island, or what would have made their loved one's burial on Hart Island a more acceptable experience. A big part of that has to do with, as Melinda said, ending the practice of mass burial on the island. This was a practice designed for handling mass burials during the Civil War. It feels really unnecessary today, and frankly, it has felt unnecessary for a long time. So we wanted to challenge the assumption in the 22 burial capacity study that this process couldn't change. But we also wanted to make the island feel a little bit more like a cemetery. When you visit private cemeteries such as Greenwood in Brooklyn, the spatial experience is defined by the memorials. They're very present. It's clear where the graves are, and through that scale, the scale of the cemetery is very clear. And yes, those are individual markers with names, but those markers are also create a communal experience. As a mourner, you understand that you're in the presence of death, and you understand that you are not alone in that experience. So that's a very powerful visual cue. Hart Island, as it currently stands, reads as a flat, mostly open plain. The graves are not present, and the scale of burial is not apparent in any way. That each of these little plastic markers you see in this image represents 150 people is hard to wrap your head around. But we also know that the city is unlikely to allow individual monuments, even very small ones, simply because they're very expensive to make and they're even more expensive to maintain. Plus, it raises the issue of where would you start? Would only the new graves get markers? How would people who had loved ones buried there before that feel? So the idea of individual markers beyond the expense also raises lots of hard questions and presents a lot of very unfair answers. So we wanted to find a way that the graves could be visually present, but not necessarily in a traditional sense. Part of Hart Island being more like a normal experience of a cemetery is the ability to walk around. Currently, you're escorted to graves by PEP officers, and you're not allowed to leave that spot. So you can see in this image, the orange marker is actually marking the grave of an individual, and the PEP officer, this is an image taken by Melinda, PEP officer is standing very close by. We don't actually know the full reason for that, and Parks has consistently declined to explain it to us, but we think it's for two reasons. First, we think that they're worried about people falling into open graves. So the current system of mass graves, in that current system, the graves can remain open for weeks at a time, waiting to be filled with the 150 bodies, now 200 bodies. And second, we also think that they may be afraid of subsidence, particularly in relation to the new mass graves, which have not had time to fully subside. New York City burials, as was said before, are natural graves. They don't involve in-ground burial vaults like most private cemeteries do. So grave vaults are these essentially concrete containers that are installed in the ground prior to the burial to make it so the cemetery can achieve a very orderly appearance that's easier to mow, essentially. On Hart Island, as the caskets and bodies decompose, they take up less space in the ground, and air trapped in those caskets gets displaced by the soil, and the surface of the ground drops. So you can see that happening very clearly in this image. If you look at where the grave markers are, that white line of markers, you can see this furrow. And that furrow is sort of marking an area where the plots have subsided, and they've sunk over about a 20-year period. If a grave hasn't subsided yet, and if people are walking on top of it, putting additional weight on it, subsidence might happen more suddenly than the city would like anyone to experience, or that you would certainly like to experience. So we wanted to find a way that visitors could walk around safely without needing to be escorted by PEP officer, and that would allow someone to roam the island if they wanted to, as you would in a private cemetery. Being able to walk around freely also means that you should be able to find the grave you're looking for with a minimum of help, which you can imagine, given the images of Hart Island, can be a little hard in a landscape like that. So in 2023, the Hart Island Project developed tools for navigating for people to accurately and consistently locate the spot on the island they want to visit. So you can do this on your phone today using the Traveling Cloud Museum. But PEP officers tell us that they're instructed not to use these free tools when locating graves. As Melinda mentioned earlier, we know that whatever happens out there needs to respond to climate change. Hurricanes, nor'easters, and mass graves that were built too close to the shoreline caused erosion and skeletal remains washing into Long Island Sound. This has a lot to do with the way Hart Island is managed by the city. Lawn grass, as most of what's out there, is not very good at erosion control. And we know that in the past, mass graves were located in parts of the island that were simply too low lying or too steep to safely host those burials, particularly of that type. So we needed to find a way to better prepare the island for storms, especially since we're likely to see an increasing number of them. And then last, we wanted to try and come up with a proposal for how Hart Island could remain a cemetery perpetually, so that its funding and access meet cultural expectations. Right now, funding is not discretionary because the burials are an essential city service. That means the city can't just take it away. The HRA burial capacity study projects 70 years of burial space left on the island. So we actually took the time to map that out, which is not something the burial capacity study does. And we actually think there's more like 27 years of burial left on the island at current rates. But even if you were to accept that 70-year projection, we still feel like the city needs a plan for what to do when the next pandemic strikes and space runs out more quickly than they were anticipating. And right now, there's not even a plan to make a plan. It's not part of the master plan, the scope of work to even identify new space for when the current island runs out of space. So, I live in Columbus, Ohio. I don't really know the real estate market in New York in the way that you do, I'm sure. But from here, it seems pretty unlikely that the city's going to come up with a couple 100-acre property that it can turn into a public cemetery. And it also seems pretty unlikely that citizens are going to welcome mass graves into their neighborhoods on adjacent city properties, which are mostly parks. So given that, it seems prudent to try to keep Hart Island open for burials well into the future. So how do we do all of that? So I'm going to start by going into detail on the burial process that we've outlined so that you can understand how we think that could work. And then we'll look at what that process would mean for the island as a whole. So we know from the burial capacity study and from Melinda's documentation over the last 30 years that the current burials on the island are 4 feet beneath the surface, or often more than 4 feet beneath the surface, but at least 4 feet beneath the surface. Given that, we believe it would be possible to conduct new burials over top of the existing mass graves without disturbing those mass graves. So Melinda, if you go to the next slide, you can see that here in this section. The mass graves are actually quite deep. And so we think there's actually enough space on top of them that we could work safely without disturbing those larger mass graves. So right now, HRA buries between 20 and 30 bodies a week. We're proposing that each week the crew on Hart Island dig a single grave that's large enough for the number of bodies to be buried that week. So rather than making a trench that's big enough for 2 months of burial, that they dig a hole that's big enough, a grave that's big enough for just that week. So that grave would be approximately 4 feet deep so that it sits safely over the top of the existing mass graves. And then the soil excavated from that grave would be stockpiled to the side. And you can see that to the one side. Caskets that are to be buried that week are placed side by side then in 2 rows, leaving a 4-inch space between each casket. That's dense, but it's not radically more dense than a private cemetery is. Once caskets are placed, the crew then marks each casket with a simple GPS tag and records it in addition to the other required information about the decedent. After that, a thin layer of sand is laid over top of and in between the caskets. And this is to allow later work crews that are tasked with potentially exhuming a body to more easily identify when they've reached the level of the caskets. The sand also helps ensure a more even rate of subsidence across the plot. Next, the excavated soil is placed back on top of the sand layer, resulting in a mound that we think would typically be about 2 feet tall. And this allows for the 3 feet of soil cover over a grave that's required by New York law. We think that the process I've just outlined could be done in 1 day. And that's really important because at the end of the day, there are no open graves on Hart Island. Once everything is in place, the mound is seeded with a perennial meadow mix. And we think it would be nice if this meadow mix could be interlaced with annual wildflowers so that at least in the first few years after each burial occurs, the meadow blooms a little bit more brightly. The next week, you do the same thing over again. The mound might be slightly bigger or smaller from 1 week to the next, but the procedure stays the same. So this is a view of what that might look like. If you go to the next slide, Melinda. Yeah, this is the view of what that might look like and feel like on the ground. Because the graves are immediately closed, visitors would be able to come the next day, and the mounds help give a visual cue and presence to the graves. And you keep doing that over a 3-year cycle. At the end of that 3 years, you mark that period with a hedgerow. So this is essentially a tree or shrub line. And this process repeats in these long strips that run down the island. And I'll explain why that is a little bit later. Over time, those mounds would subside and become less apparent. And simultaneously, those deep-rooted meadow plantings would take their place visually, while also helping to keep the island's soil in place. The meadows would also provide a lot better habitat and require a lot less maintenance over time than the current lawn plantings do. And once established, you would mow the meadows once or twice a year rather than, every other week or so. The hedgerows would also come in over time, and they would help us in a couple of ways. First, they would act as a way to humanize the scale of the island. We think it would be overwhelming to see rank upon rank of these mounds. And so they break down that scale, and they also frame views of the sound. When you're on Hart Island, the sound is very present and it's very beautiful. And so we hope that it may be comforting to have that sound, sort of the eye drawn to the sound a little bit more. More practically, the hedgerows, by breaking down the scale of the island and the graves, also help us with wayfinding. Each hedgerow can be a little different simply by varying the species that you're planting in that hedgerow. So they give people a way to navigate the island that's a little less blunt than a sign. They also add to the island's habitat value, and maybe most importantly, they work as windbreaks. This would make the island a little bit more pleasant to be on in the winter months, and it would help to reduce the erosive force of the wind across the island. Visitors would be able to use the GPS tags that are included on each casket in order to locate each grave with their phone. So you could go out, you could find exactly where you were going just with the handheld device. The Hart Island Project already maintains a website that allows people to do this as part of the Traveling Cloud Museum. So this software exists and it's totally free already. And again, because the graves are closed immediately, there's no potential issue with people falling into open graves, and the mounds and meadows clearly indicate the areas of the island that you should and shouldn't walk on. So if we take that process and we zoom out and look at the island as a whole, you can see the pattern that process makes across the landscape. These long 3-year plots result from a desire to maintain some of the island's existing infrastructure. Hart Island already has this paved central spine that you can see there in the purple. And it's actually one of the very few areas on the island where we're sure there aren't any burials, and we really don't want to run roads over graves. So we've taken that north-south road as a central spine, and then the paths that run off of it in either direction, perpendicular to it, are just mown. So there's no need to put down road bed, etc. If we play that out across the whole island, we can accommodate about 43 years of burial at slightly higher than current rates. We think that process would start in what we're calling the central meadow. Melinda's pointing to it there. So this is a spot on the island where the graves are over 30 years old and have certainly subsided completely at this point. From there, it would move north up the bluff, and it would from there it would move to the very southernmost part of the island and move north again. So that means that 30 or more years would pass before we would reach the part of the island where burials are happening right now, if that makes sense. So you'd give the current mass trenches that are being dug today 30 years to settle before you'd actually be doing any work over top of them. As we said before, there are areas of the island that are too steep or too low-lying for burial. So you can see those here in the purple. So our strategy stays well away from these areas. The northwest quadrant of the island was once the site of mass burials, but it's very low-lying. And we recommend gradually reforesting that area as a memorial grove. Once the 40-year cycle is complete, i.e. once you've completed the pattern one time over across the island, we're calling for a very simple form of grave reuse. So often this method is referred to as lift and deepen, and it's a fairly common practice in private cemeteries already when space is needed in family plots. So when a grave is reused, each plot is excavated. And unlike private cemeteries, Hart Island burials are green because there are no grave vaults and the city does not embalm. So at this point, 40 plus years on, there should only be skeletal remains. So any of those skeletal remains that are still there would be consolidated into a mortuary box that would then be placed at the head of the grave. A new casket is then put into place and the grave is closed again. So you can see both of those in this image. You can see both of the new casket and the mortuary box in that image. So in this way, the location of the grave doesn't change even after the grave is reused. So a person visiting the grave of a loved one 60, 70, 80 years later would still go to the same location of on the island. The GPS tag and the sand layer would facilitate this process. It would make it easier to do that disinterment. And this is almost identical to the way this happens in private family plots all across the United States. And the only difference here, and I think Melinda and I have been sort of thinking about it this way for a while, is the only difference is that Hart Island is New York's family plot, right? So you might not be buried with your great uncle, but you're buried in a kind of common plot the city shares. So that was a lot of information, and happy to go back and dig into detail, but we thought we'd leave some time for questions and discussion here. And I would also say we are really eager for feedback. So if you have thoughts or responses to this, like, this is a project that's in process, and so we really do want to hear from people.
Great. Thank you so much, Melinda and Jake. Really fascinating information and plans and proposals that you put forth before us today. There's a few questions already. I encourage folks in attendance to add your questions and comments in the Q&A, or if you'd like to go live and ask something directly. We can give you permission to speak. We just ask that you limit your comments to or questions to a reasonable amount of time, so we have as many people asking questions or providing comments as possible. So we have a few questions and comments right now. I'll go ahead and read them out, and then Melinda and Jake, if you'd like to reply to them, you can feel free to do so. There's two from Diane Alexander Rodriguez. What does this mean for my brother John Alexander and my mom Mary Ditmar? How do I know if my mother is buried there still?
You want to take that one, Melinda? I can answer that one.
Well, you can call the office of the chief medical examiner and ask them if your mother is buried there still. They have a database and they speak directly to families about that. So then as far as what would happen to the location where your mother is buried, is that what we showed you was there would be another layer of burials added on top at that location. Your mother wouldn't be moved, she'd still be at that location. But since the city is already burying 4 deep, they've already switched over to an additional layer. This would be then the practice. And then of the ones that were added, the individual graves that are added on top of the existing graves, those graves would use the lift and deepen method sometime in the future so that the city wouldn't run out of burial space. So essentially, neither of your relatives would move. They would remain in the same location unless you were to disinter them.
Right. And if they're buried there now and you haven't had them moved, then they're still there.
Okay, let's see. Here's a comment by Mary Petretti. Consider native plants for the meadow plantings. The New York City Parks Department has a native plant center, 13-acre greenhouse, nursery, and seed bank complex.
Absolutely. Yes, that is what's going to thrive out there.
Okay, there's a comment / question by Tara Schmidt. I'm confused. You indicate you want to end mass burials on Hart Island. However, the proposal sounds like mass burials.
Yeah, I think that's a really astute observation. I mean, we are still burying, between 20 and 30 people at a time. We're just not burying them on top of one another. So, private cemeteries bury 20 to 30 people a day, granted not in one plot. I think that one of the things that's tough about the current system of mass burials is that you've got people that are stacked 4 deep, right? And so one location, horizontal location on the island corresponds to 4 people. And I think that's sometimes hard to wrap your head around. Whereas in what we're proposing, yes, they would all be buried at the same time, but you would essentially go to the plot. You'd be able to go to essentially an individual plot that would kind of have much the same spacing as a private cemetery would.
Anything to add to that, Melinda?
Yeah, I mean, if you witness burials at private cemeteries, they are concrete vaults that are absolutely smack next to the next concrete vault. So there's no space in private cemeteries between bodies. The vaults themselves define the burial space. So that's what you're getting one way or another, unless you own a burial space that you purchased a long time ago in New York City. All of the cemeteries have structured burial vaults that are one right next to another.
Okay, here's an interesting question by Carol Ann Maletti. How the plan takes into account infant burials.
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, I think we're thinking about the infant burials in much the same way. They represent, Melinda, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about a third of the burials on the island are infant burials, and we think they would be handled in much the same pattern, and so it wouldn't be they wouldn't be isolated in the way they are now. They would be, I think, with the adults, but I think that is something that I'm certainly open to thoughts about.
The infant burials have also gotten a lot denser. When you go to visit an infant grave, it's a pretty small space for 1,000 babies when you're standing there. It's, kind of a small bedroom size.
Like 12 by 12.
Yeah. And so when you go to visit a recent, burial of an infant, there's often 2 or 3 families, either sharing the same plot or in the adjacent plot, and you're all there together. So it's much, much denser for the infant burial. So I think you have to treat each person as an individual. And I think that's what would help many families feel that their loved one received a proper burial by the city. And I think it was also encouraged New Yorkers to choose Hart Island over cremation, which is the only kind of affordable thing for most people. And if you die within the city of New York, a burial on Hart Island is free.
Let's see, here's a question from Vivian Young. How many visitors does the island currently receive on a daily basis?
None, because there are not daily visits. There are about 2 public visits a month, one to the north end of the island, one to the south end of the island, that you can win. If you win the lottery, you can go with 25 other people. And then there are 2 family visits per month. And if you have someone buried there or a close friend buried there, you can visit with, again, about 30 other people. And that's it. So 4 times a month, there are visitors. There's 180 to 100 visitors a month. So there isn't a daily number because there isn't ferry service and there isn't access.
Right. And really, that's one of the things that we're responding to. And to be fair, that Parks is responding to also, is trying to increase that number so that it's possible to be
No,
out
no,
there.
the master
Well,
plan
master
is
plan
is
doesn't
not
go
to increase it.
with.
Actually, that was one of the shocking things about the master plan
Yeah.
is there's no plan to increase it, even though the city is purchasing a new ferry and building a new ferry dock for millions of dollars. There is no plan to increase access unless the public demands it. So
Right.
this is the time to write to your city council person and
Right.
say that you want to have open access, because winning the lottery, only 10% of the people who enter the lottery win. And it's on a Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. So you have to take time off of work to go out to City Island, and you're done by about 1:30 in the afternoon. But that's not really, for working people, that's not really an option.
Right. Well, and if you would like to celebrate the day to remember the day, the anniversary of a death, like unless your loved one died on a Sunday, it's not going to happen. And a lot of people have responded that that's really problematic.
Okay, so speaking of visitation, here's a question directly related to that. Then I'll circle back to some of the others. Is there a difference between the north and south tours?
Yeah,
Been on both of
they're
them.
very different tours. The historic burials were all in the north end of Hart Island. So the old Potter's Field is there. And the city didn't start burying in the south until 1989, with this onset of the AIDS epidemic a little bit earlier for individual graves. So the north end of the island is more about the Department of Charities and Correction and that functioning, and the south part of the island is more about the institutions that were there, Phoenix House, the AIDS burials, and they just have a different feel to them. Also, all of the Civil War stuff was in the north end and the prison facility. So the south end was more social services, and north end was more war and penal system. But you should be able to just go there on your own and walk around the whole island, not have to win the lottery to visit, to go on a tour. It's not normal access to a cemetery anywhere in the United States. That's not normal access.
So there's a few questions and comments related to family burials there, and if there's other folks in attendance who have similar questions or comments, always interesting to see those. This is again from Diane Alexander Rodriguez, who says that my mother was buried there in 1987. Let's
Yeah.
see, a
So
couple.
I'll just jump in and say to Diane, that means that your mother's grave wasn't reused because they had stopped reusing graves by that point. So
Yeah.
her body is still there in the same place that they would have put it.
Yeah, and it's marked on the map on our website. If you go into your mother's profile and you click on the link, it'll take you to that location.
That's right. And after this webinar, when we circulate the recording, it's very easy to find the Hart Island project online. But I'll send a link to everyone just so they have it in their email. If you haven't had a chance to get on the website between now and then Diana, I encourage you to do it at that point and check it out. Let's see, a couple questions, one from George Torres Jr. and one from Mrs. H, both along the same lines, basically what the process is to recover a loved one's remains.
Well, the first thing you need to do is get a death certificate, which you can order from the New York City Department of Health Vital Statistics. You can do it online, and it can take about a year if it's an older burial. And then you have to hire your own private funeral director who files the paperwork at the medical examiner. And the Department of Burial Services at HRA can help you with this process. So
Right.
it's a little longer process if you're a relative who was buried some time ago, and a little faster if the burial was recent. But it also means that your family didn't agree to a city burial. If your family agreed to a city burial, then the city does not have an obligation to return the remains if you change your mind.
One of the questions also mentioned that their loved one was buried 10 years ago, and that's probably, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Melinda, that's probably a much harder ask to
No,
retrieve those
it's no
remains.
problem, actually. It's actually no problem. It's just a matter of, like, during these months when the ground is frozen, they don't disinter. So they disinter usually up until November, and then they don't start again until April. So just for the reason that the ground is frozen. But no, it takes them about 2 hours to get a body out, and then they hand it over directly to the funeral director. So it's not a problem. Actually, the burial practice, that's one thing. After 150 years, they've figured out how to disinter relatively easily.
Okay, let's see. Are the use of vaults a more modern invention? I have family at Woodlawn, and the older plots are sunken, as are all those surrounding them.
Yeah, the use of grave vaults came about in the mid 19th century as a way to keep that from happening, from the ground from sinking in that way. But one of the issues is that it stops the decomposition process. So the use of grave vaults isn't considered a green burial anymore, even though it's widely practiced in private American cemeteries. That is 90% of the time what you're going to find is grave vaults. I think that one of the issues with doing that on Hart Island is that it slows down the burial process, and because they're harder to construct, it's also way more expensive. Grave vaults are one of the reasons why private burial is very expensive in the United States.
Okay, here's a question from Jorge Matos. Can you shed some light on who is buried on the island and under what circumstances they've ended up there? Thanks.
Oh, there's such a range of stories. One of the reason we built the Traveling Cloud Museum is so we would have a repository of those stories. So you can go in yourself and see the full range and read the stories about those who are buried. And if you go into a profile, you can select within a plot for a list of all the people within the plot who have stories added. So that's an easy way to sort through all the range of people that are buried there. But as with all cemeteries, it reflects the diversity of the city of New York. So all those waves of immigrants, including sort of the current wave of immigrant people who walked from South America and whatnot, those people are now being buried if they succumbed in the city of New York. And I've been on trips where other people from Colombia and Guatemala are visiting their relative who died relatively recently, having walked to Texas. So it's really a history of the city of New York that is there and should be something that everyone can partake of.
It looks like there's one person with their hand up, Kelly Boyero. So let me give you permission, Kelly, to talk. Okay, you'll just have to unmute yourself, Kelly. Let's see. Okay. If you can just unmute yourself, Kelly. If it's not working, then we'll go on. Give it another minute or two. Another second or two, I should say. Looks like it's not working for some reason, Kelly. So if you want to go ahead and put your question or comment in the Q&A, and we'll go ahead and move on.
I wanted to answer this question, Norman Danzig.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Are you going to change the rules of how burials are conducted? We don't make the rules, but we hope they will change. So if you are a resident of the city of New York, we hope that you will reach out to your city council person and ask for them to be changed. The rules of who gets a burial, gets a death certificate and whatnot, those are Department of Health rules that we don't have anything to do with. So those are privacy rules govern who is considered a close relative. And the medical examiner determines who is eligible to be able to determine if someone is, buried on Hart Island or privately buried. So we are not addressing those rules.
Okay, great. And then Tara Schmidt, again, the records that were lost in a fire, there were no copies anywhere. Has there been an effort to recreate this info?
Well, we can't recreate that info. It's thousands of people buried from June 1961 through July 1977. That was all lost. And other periods, there are gaps, other periods too. And one of the reasons that I did a Freedom of Information request in 2008 was to simply get the city to duplicate the records because they were kept in a trailer on Hart Island, 6 feet above sea level, no climate controls at all. So even the ones that we have from the late 70s, starting, August 1977 through to 1980, those 2 volumes are very, very difficult to read because they were so damaged by the conditions in which they were kept, in the cold, in the humidity. So no, there's absolutely no chance of retrieving those records. But if you are eligible to receive a death certificate, the death certificate will say if it, where the body was transferred. And if it's Hart Island, it usually says city or city cemetery.
Just a comment by Lorraine Braun. The process of finding a friend of mine through the Hart Island Project went smoothly and professionally. She passed in October 2022 and was buried in March 2023. Glad to volunteer since 2023.
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine. Lorraine helped to enter a huge amount of data for 2023, which we rely on volunteers to do.
Absolutely. There's more questions. Let me just I'll skip around a little bit, but this is a question for you, Melinda. What made you take on this project? This is from Tara Schmidt. This is an incredibly ambitious effort, and I commend you.
It had to do with becoming an American citizen and wondering what happened to all these people that I, stood in court going through this immigration process, which even for someone like me that passes as American was grueling. So it just seemed to me that it was relatively easy to fall through the cracks. And also my generation is the AIDS generation. So lots of people I know got AIDS and just died, when we were in our 20s and early 30s. So it was in some ways a search for those people.
It's a question from Vivian Young. I once read that photography on Parks Department tours are not allowed. Are family members also restricted from taking photos? If so, why is photography not allowed on the island?
Photography is allowed. We changed that.
Great. Okay, let's see. Here's a practical question by Diane Alexander Rodriguez. Again, I'm coming in from Worcester, Massachusetts by Peter Pan bus line. How do I get to Hart Island from New York City?
The Parks Department has instructions listed, but basically you take the number 6 to the end of the line, and then you get on a bus to City Island, and you get off at Fordham Street on the bus and walk east to the dock. So you have to allow a lot of time on the weekend for the subway to get you all the way to Pelham Bay Park.
And you have to submit that request to be included on that very well in advance. That's the other thing. So if you're on the bus now, it may not.
Oh, yeah, you have to, she knows that you have to make an appointment to visit, and then you have to take the bus from Worcester, and then wherever you're staying, you need to somehow get yourself to City Island by either 9:30 in the morning or 12:30 in the afternoon to check in.
Okay, let's see. This is a question from Francie. In or around spring 2021, there were announcements that jazz festivals might be staged near Potter's Field. Any awareness of that proposal or its status? I hadn't heard that one.
No, I've never heard that either. Would
Let's
be
see.
great.
Yeah. Here's another question from Diane Alexander Rodriguez. Will you guys be doing another Zoom? Would definitely be open to doing another Zoom, not to put Jake and Melinda on the spot, but there's certainly so much on Hart Island alone that we could do many Zooms. So hopefully we will do other Zooms for sure. Okay, let's see. We'll have time for just a few more questions, I think, before we wrap it up for tonight. There's a few more in here. Another question from Tara Schmidt. Have you given your proposal to the City of New York or whoever decides who makes these changes, and what else can we do to move the needle?
Great question.
Perfect
Yes,
question.
we have tried to meet with the Parks
Okay.
Department. And we have been meeting with city council members. So if you could reach out to your city council member and ask them if they would like for us to do a half-hour presentation, we would be happy to do that. So that's what moves the needle, is constituents contacting their council members and talking about this. So it's a way of securing a better burial space for yourself. Think of it that way.
Right. And along those lines, Alan Kay asked if there's anything in addition to writing or getting in touch with city council members that folks can do.
Well, you can join our organization, so you kind of follow along, which I know, Ellen, you are doing. You can make a small donation, which really helps us to do the work. You can talk about it as much as possible, and get other people to contact their city council members. But really, that's the process is legislation. We would like for the city council to order the Parks Department to reconsider the burial practice as part of the master plan before the city council funds it. They can reject the proposal that comes through Star Whitehouse because it doesn't address this issue of running out of space. And the city needs to plan for things like that. If you're running out of space in 27 years, now is the time to come up with a plan. Either you have to start recycling or you have to find new burial space.
Okay, a couple more questions along those lines. One from Tara asking, even though Tara doesn't live in New York City anymore, can someone who doesn't live in New York City still reach out to a council member even though they don't represent them?
You can, but they don't have to return your calls.
Yes.
So that's the, but it's, if you have a relative buried there, then you can write the mayor and whatnot and ask for the city to honor your friend or relative's burial site by ending mass burials.
Okay, let's see. And is there a form letter on the website that folks can use to send to city council members?
Great idea.
We don't have a form letter. I guess we could do that, but it's better to just call them. And if you reach out to me in advance, I can give you some talking points. We did that before the Star White House presentation, we came up with talking points. So it's better if it comes from you as a concerned citizen that you think it's wrong for the city to have mass burials. And if
Right.
it's unnecessary, if there's, I mean, part of the reason we did this is not just to complain, but to show that there is a way of doing this, a proof of concept,
Right.
so that the city council knows what to ask of the agency.
Right. I think that's a really important point, Melinda. You don't have to remember all the details of our plan in order to talk to your city council member. The point of the plan is just to prove that it could be done, that it's possible to not do mass burials anymore. I don't even think, I mean, we like our plan, but there could be another way of doing it too. The point of the plan is just to say like, oh, look, it's possible. Which is
Right.
something that we kind of want New York City Parks to do and a landscape architecture firm to do, rather than just like an individual professor working in Ohio.
Yeah, but you know,
Go ahead.
when you come up, one of the ways that we ended penal control was to build a database, get the documents, build a database, reconnect the city of New York through storytelling to its cemetery. And that laid the groundwork for the legislation. So again, having a proof of concept brings that discussion to the fore that why are we doing this? This is a scar on New York City. It's the worst public relations thing to have your cemetery providing mass burials and essentially disappearing people. So you want to ask the city to do something that makes that honors the people who were citizens of New York, who built the city, and ensures that future generations are remain a part of the history of the city and are not sort of isolated in this place where you have to win a lottery to go visit their grave. I mean, that's just crazy. That's not who we are.
Let's see. Francie asked whose district Hart Island is in, and which council committee would have the jurisdiction to schedule the public hearing.
Which council committee? I think it's Diana Ayala's. There's a real estate committee, but I think it's more the committee that oversees HRA, which is Health and Human Services. So we've been meeting with with the Parks Committee, which is not so interested, but Diana Ayala, who's the deputy speaker, she was very involved in the legislation ending penal control, and she is also chair of the committee that oversees HRA, and HRA conducts the burials. So the master plan should include a strategy for managing the landscape with burials that go on indefinitely, so Hart Island doesn't have to close. And in order to do that, you have to figure out where you're going to put the bodies. But the actual burials are conducted by the Human Resource Administration. And so that committee is the one that could demand an end to mass burials. They can legislate it.
Okay, so gonna end, I think, with just a couple comments. One from Susan Jaycox, who's been on both sides of the island tours and wants to thank Melinda and her work in getting the island finally open for tours. And then one from Tawana Custodio. I think this is probably a fitting ending. And then, Melinda and Jake, if you have final comments. This is from Tawana. I was able to visit the island in September of 2019. I was also able to add a story and name to my baby through the Hart Island Project. Thank you so much for giving life to our loved ones.
Oh, you're very welcome, Tawana. And I'm glad that we were able, many of the babies are buried under their mother's name. And it's very important to the mother for people to know that she named her child, that her child was a person. And so we always change the name to what the mother named her child. And I think that's really, really important. So I'm glad that we were able to do that for you.
Great. And any closing comments from either of you, Jake or Melinda?
Well, as far as this being an election year, this is a question we could ask the candidates. How do you feel about ending mass burials on Hart Island? Pin them down. Absolutely. I mean, it should be, this is such an easy thing to fix, because it would be cheaper to do what we're proposing. These really deep, huge, gigantic trenches are dangerous. It's expensive because you have to hire construction workers to dig the holes. And if the city adopted our plan, it would save money, it would save space, and more importantly, it would be culturally acceptable. So it's a good topic for election year, asking people, how do you feel about ending mass burials on Hart Island?
Absolutely. Well, thank you both, Melinda and Jake, for a really stimulating presentation and conversation tonight. Thank you for those of you who attended. We'll go ahead and end for tonight, but hope to see all of you at our future events, and stay tuned because we'd definitely like to do more events around Hart Island at the Bronx Historical Society as well. So thank you, everyone. Like I said, I'll send a follow-up email. Could be tomorrow, but more likely it'll be early next week with this recording and some resources and links. And look forward to seeing all of you at future events. So everyone have a good night, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.